When Solomon Juneau set up here in 1846, he had an early trading post. Solomon Juneau was also very good in getting some of the early mercantile stores, the early ones that would set up their product and have that readily available. Him being a businessman traveling from Green Bay to Milwaukee, Solomon was trading with the Indians, having the trading post, but he also knew all the other resources that people were going to be needing, whether it was some of the early boarding houses and restaurants and such. Solomon Juneau put a mill on the Rock River. That mill stayed there till 1895, and in its production it backed up, made a 2,000-acre lake. But that mill was very important because they could harvest the wood off the land, and that could help build many of the homes and the buildings that were needed, and clearing the timber at the same time. Pioneer Beer, it was one of the early breweries that started here. It was started by the Oberle family in 1849, and then 1852, Benedict Weber purchased the brewery. And within the Dodge County area at that time, there were small little towns where this beer was sent to. Now, knowing that back in the day it wasn't as easy to get beer to those areas, each of those small little towns would have an ice house where they could keep the beer chilled. So small communities like Knowles and parts of Mayville, they even had a tunnel set up down by Neno in the Addison area. Also, the brewery being built on by the Rock River, they could cut the ice, and they had that available. The caves are still underneath the brewery when it was built in the late 1840s, and they would cut the ice in the winter, and they could preserve that to keep the beer cold. Having around 8 saloons at the time, each of those customers, as long as they were serving their Pioneer beer, they would take care of them to make sure that there was always ice in the ice box to serve.
Well, this is a pretty historic community, actually, because Solomon Juneau was the first mayor of Milwaukee and the founder of the Milwaukee Sentinel, and he's got a lot of statues made to him in Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee. And this is his only home that's still standing. And it happens to be in Theresa, Solomon Juneau's second home. He got sick of living in Milwaukee, so he moved out here. He had a trading post out here already and been trading with the Indians, but his wife didn't like it in the city anymore, so she talked him into coming out here, making this his permanent home. And when he did die, he was living here in Theresa. He had gone up to Shawano to powwow with the Indians, something to do with the U.S. government, the payment he had to make, because he must have worked for the government too, and he was such a friend of the Indians, and they trusted him so much that he dealt with them on behalf of the government. And he went up to Shawano to do this, and there were no roads going up there. He went up there partially on Lake Winnebago and then on trails, and he had a severe heart attack and died up there at Shawano at the Indian reservation where the Indians were. And they thought so much of him that they wanted to bury him up there. But eventually word got down to his sons down here, and it maybe was a week or two after his death that he had had a stroke or a heart attack up there and died. And then eventually they got his body back and took it back to Milwaukee, and he's buried at the cemetery in Milwaukee.
My family came here in the 1850s. My great-great-grandfather, John Polster, settled here, purchasing his land from Solomon Juneau, descendants from Germany, settled in this area, setting up a farm estate just south of town. The Theresa Historical Society, preserving that history from all those early descendants that settled here. The Juneau home itself has a unique story. A gentleman by the name of Joseph Gotwell preserved the home Back in the 1930s, it was going to be torn down, and he purchased the home and later donated it back to the village of Theresa. And now we have that historical preservation for all to enjoy. The early church that was founded was the St. Peter, the Lutheran church that was in town. Then the church after was St. Theresa Catholic Church. Bishop Henny purchased the land from Solomon Juneau for $500. Setting up the fire department was all started because of a small fire that happened at the Catholic Church.
We have the original musket and the American flag from the Civil War brought back to Theresa by Ludwig Wirth, who's a local boy, and he's buried on the Catholic cemetery. And we have that flag from the 1860s and the musket that he carried in battle in the Civil War. Now, we used to have a GAR post here too, Grand Army of the Republic, and we have a picture of them in the Legion. And there must be over 20 veterans on that picture. And there are only a couple names that are common today in this area that you could say, well, that man, he's got relatives living in the town Theresa. My great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. He's buried in the Catholic cemetery, but he isn't on that GAR picture.
The big period for German immigration into the United States and South America lasted from 1849, following the failed revolution of 1848, and it lasted until about 1868 or so. And I know from listening to family stories that at the time the Wagners left Germany, they were pretty much paid to leave. The Junkers in Prussia, they were the aristocracy. They didn't want, there were too many peasants, not enough land. They did not want any more trouble like that which occurred in 1848. So the passage of my great-great-grandfather, his brother, and his wife and children was subsidized, if not paid for entirely, by the Prussian aristocracy. I can't imagine any good reason why anybody would voluntarily get on a sailing ship in mid to late November to cross the Atlantic Ocean unless there's a lot of pressure to leave. And I suspect that was the case with many of the German immigrants. When you've been hounded out of your own country, it doesn't matter what your background is, it doesn't matter what your religious affiliation is, you're all literally in the same boat.
My parents came from Switzerland. My dad came over about 1900, and many of the Swiss boys that came over went into cheese factories. There's many cheese factories in Dodge County, and the cheesemakers all have Swiss names. Later on, my mother came over, his girlfriend, and when he went to pick her up in New York, they told him that you'll have to be married to come in. So they were married in New York City. My dad worked in a cheese factory near Kikoski, Alvin Coley. Later on, he worked in a factory in Loyal, Wisconsin. And in 1922, he heard about this cheese factory in Theresa being for sale, and they purchased the factory.
My father immigrated from Germany in the early 20s, right after the war. And he was sponsored by an uncle in Kansas. That's the only way that you could immigrate. At that time, you had to have a sponsor that promised he would take care of you and your needs. At that time, he worked maybe for $1 a day or whatever on his uncle's farm, and got my mother over the following year. They were friends in Germany. It was during the dust storms when this all took place, and I know my mother would tell me the stories how when they went to church on Sundays, which was almost a sure thing in those years, they had to clean the benches off so they could sit without sitting in all the dust. And she didn't like it, so they lived down there for a couple years. In fact, my sister was born down there. And then they came up, had to be about like 24, 25. She had an uncle in the Theresa area, St. Paul's. He was the pastor there for, I don't know, something like close to 40 years. He found this farm for him right over here that was for rent, and that's how they happened to come up here. I told my folks for years, I always saw Uncle Walter, that was his name, his last name. He must really like horses, because whenever he'd come out to the farm, like once a week with his old Buick, first thing he'd do is walk in the barn and look at them horses. And I thought he admired horses, but in later years I found out, no, they had borrowed the money from him to buy them. That's why he was checking on the horses. The farm was owned by the same people that owned the local brewery. That gave us a chance to get some of the waste feed from the brewery, which always did a little better with our animals than the other ones did in the area. We usually kept right around 20 cows, which at that time was a good-sized herd. Originally had to milk them by hand. At 800 pounds, we were the biggest producers at Widmer cheese.
Ralph and Jamie were in the service. I hauled milk those 2 years, and I helped Johnny make cheese till the afternoon, and then I'd go home. And next day do the same thing over until Ralph came home. Jim did not work in the factory, but Jim and I are the same age, 91. He's 4 months older than I am, I think. And Ralph, of course, is quite a bit older. There was difference in age between Ralph and Jim. I hauled canned milk for Widmer's almost 40 years. There were 51 farmers, and now 5 farmers have more milk than the 51 had. When we hauled, some farmers only had 3 cows. Some had 5, 6, 7. That's the way it was, they milking by hand.
The milk in the early years was of very poor quality. When the farmer would milk his cows in the evening, he'd put it in a water tank that would cool overnight. So the milk never got any colder than the temperature of the water. They just didn't keep things as clean as they do now. So we didn't always have such good luck when we received some bad milk, especially in summertime. Now milk is cooled to 40 degrees as fast as they milk the cows, and their equipment is all washed automatically, and it's a whole different thing. And of course all the small farms are gone now. We used to have as high as 50 farms sending milk to our factory. A farm could be 80 acres on average, and maybe 30 or 40 cows. They made a living and they had a good life, but now it's all these mega farms.
We had chickens on this farm, and you could trade those at the store for flour and sugar, the necessities. I still can't eat brick cheese because at that time, when it got towards the end of the month and the grocery funds were running very low, Dad would say when I took the milk to the plant, and bring a brick of cheese along. That the Widmers would take off our milk check that we were going to get at the end of the month, that you could buy a cheese on credit. And Dad loved his brick cheese, but I never developed a taste for it. I guess I had too much of it.
During World War II and also the Depression, my parents had to be very frugal. When they would sell a calf, they'd get about 75 cents, and one time my dad needed a new pair of overalls, so they went out to buy a new pair of overalls, and it cost 75 cents. So it took a whole calf for just a pair of overalls. I was born at Allenton and lived there until 1957, when I married and moved to Theresa, where a lot of our ancestors also lived. And my name is Evangeline Martin Kohl. The Kohl family comes from Koblenz, Germany, which I'm very proud of. I am quite fluent with the German language yet.
My mother was very firm about talk German when we were home. She did not want us talking English. So a lot of us kids went to school knowing all no English. I was lucky my sister had 5 years older, and she had been in school, and she'd come home and teach me a little English. So we had a very wonderful teacher by the name of Camilla Weber. She was related actually to the people that owned this farm. And she was just a wonderful person, and she'd help all. Most of the kids were in the same shape. They knew nothing but German.
My great-great-great-grandfather was from East Prussia, and he immigrated here, and he had a farm north of Theresa here. At that time, our name was spelled Mussack. So we were basically all German. In fact, I think my older brothers and sisters, they spoke German at home.
I remember going to anniversary parties, anniversary dances at Theresa Station. My parents are really distant relatives in the Weber family, would hold their anniversary parties at the dance hall, which was upstairs, and the bar was downstairs. And one of the Weber, my great uncles, was the station master at the railroad. When my uncle moved from Antigo, he was doing dairy inspecting, state dairy inspector. And then they moved from Antigo to Juneau, and they had a home on the lake. And I thought that was so fascinating. So when they came to visit my parents one year in March for my dad's birthday, then I said I wanted to go back with them and visit with them for a while and stay with them for a couple of days. So okay, that was considered permissible. And I wanted to come back on the train or the bus. But then when it came Sunday morning and we were to leave for Juneau, Uncle Hiram and Aunt Marie and Cousin Michael, then my mother said, we have to wait a while because Grandma is going along too, Grandma Elvina Weber. They just didn't trust me going alone. But then when we were supposed to be going on the train, there was a snowstorm at Allenton and West Bend, so they knew they wouldn't be able to get to West Bend to pick us up at the depot. So then they called and they said, wait and see if it's better tomorrow, we'll let you know. So the next day we did take the train out of Juneau, and when we got to West Bend, we had to walk a couple blocks to get to the drugstore that we were told to call home, that they knew it was time to come and pick us up. We were doing fine until we stepped into the drugstore door, and Grandma fell over flat on her back. And I was first going to help her, but when I tried to open her coat and I took off her glasses, she was very limp. And here Grandma had passed away, yeah. What do? I went to the counter and I asked them to use the phone because I needed to call a doctor. They said, you don't need to call a doctor, we have a doctor right here. So he went to look at Grandma and he said, yes, she has passed away. So then I had to call an undertaker because she was right in front of the door. The door couldn't even be, well, the doctor could have moved the body though, but she was right in front of the door, so they wanted the undertaker there as quickly as possible. So I called the undertaker that I knew that did the Weber funerals, the Weber relatives who were at West Bend, and then Mother and Dad came to pick me up. And I was about 19 years old at that time.
Like we had to walk to Sunday school, and we were on our way home from Sunday school with William and myself, and Hannah, who had a lot to do with the brewery. He was pretty well to do. He would go to, there used to be a restaurant, and he'd go there every morning for coffee. And that time it was Highway 41, and he always would make a U-turn right in the middle of the road. And that particular morning, walking home from school, he was hit, and he was laying outside the car, really in bad shape. And that was in my mind for a long time. I remember his tongue going in and out.
Lived right across the road from the public school in the village. I never had to take a school bus to school. We had 10 grades in the local school, 8 grades, and then 2 grades of high school. State graded school it was called at that time, and there were several others in the colony, so I had it pretty nice in that respect. I had Camilla Weber as a teacher. She was my first school teacher, taught me in the first grade, second grade, and third grade, I think. And she was really a wonderful teacher. We had a teacher in the mid-grades, 5th, 6th, and 7th. Her name was Miss Manas. She must have been there 20, 25 years at least. And then after that, you graduated from the 8th grade, and then you went into the state-graded school. That would be 9th and 10th grade. Mrs. Kendall was my teacher. She came from Hartford, drove every day to Theresa to teach.
Around 1960, I, Lester Beck, and Fred Banlow decided that it would be a nice thing to save the pictures, the old pictures of Theresa. We started copying photographs. By copying, I mean we took pictures of the photograph, then developed the film, and then enlarged the pictures. At first, we would ask people if we could see their photo collection. A lot of them would have a bunch of photos loose in a shoebox. Shoeboxes were common in those days. People bought shoes and kept those boxes. I would do the copying and print the pictures, and then I'd give them to Les Speck. Les was 12 years my senior, and he, as a young boy, was interested in history, and he talked to old people, and he'd remember their stories. And so Les would write the captions for the pictures, and my wife would put the caption under the pictures. And these were 11 by 14 pictures. So we purchased an old IBM wide carriage. We rolled the pictures right in. Shirley would type the caption under the picture. So we did hundreds of them. And right now we have 52 volumes, each one about 60 pictures.
Everybody could skate and everybody could swim too, because we learned how to swim in the river. We had a swimming hole that the village provided for us. Had a raft out in the middle of the river, and even had some bathhouses One was for the boys and one was for the girls. Had sand and gravel that the village threw into the river that it wasn't all mud. And that was a swimming hole. And that's where we learned how to swim, and everybody knew how to swim. It was a pretty busy place during the summer months when it was so hot. And in the wintertime, everybody went ice skating. Everybody had a pair of skates, and we could skate at an early age. And we had ice hockey we played a lot of, and we had a pretty good league that we played in at an older age. Kikoski and Barton and West Bend, even Shorewood was in the league, and Mayville. And we had a pretty good league and played ice hockey outdoors. And I can remember playing ice hockey when it was 0 degrees, really cold, which you'd never think of doing today anymore. And when you were young, you could take the cold a lot better than you can today. And then we had a wooden box that we had to build one ourselves. And the first box we had built was behind Al Trolby's garage, Chevrolet garage. Now today it's the TSB Bank, right behind them there. And then to the east of that, that was pretty empty there. There wasn't anybody living there. It was all grass and nice place to build a hockey box, so we built one there. The local tavern keeper was our sponsor. His name was Paul Kicker, and he also owned a hall, which is still standing, but that was a meeting place, and on Memorial Day, American Legion would always have their programs there, and then they'd have the local band play, and some speaker would speak, and it was all pretty professionally done, because people seem to observe Memorial Day much more than they do today. We did have a village band at one time, and it was a very good band. And Andrew Pitchler was the director, and he was a music teacher, and he was also the director of the village band. And everybody played a musical instrument. The Pioneer Band used to have band concerts in the summertime, at least once a month, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe even twice a month. It was always on a Wednesday night. Farmers would come in with their eggs to barter at the local stores or 2 grocery stores, and the band would play, and the cars would be lined up in the street, and the people would be lined up on the sidewalk on benches listening to the band play. And there was a Chevrolet dealership and a Buick dealership, and plus my dad's place. We were a hub of activity here. We had a lot of business places right on US 41. After US 41 was rebuilt 3 miles to the east, US 41 is the interstate now. All the businesses slowly left the community. But we had 2 grocery stores and a meat locker, shoe repairman, and he sold shoes and clothes too. And we also had a druggist at one time. Charlie Rather was his name. And he had a store directly across from the Pioneer Keg today. He made all the prescriptions for Dr. Lungenfeld. Years ago, the doctors didn't give you the pills like they do today. They always gave you something liquid, something you could drink. I can remember having some illness, and I'd get some real terrible tasting red stuff the doctor dispensed that seemed to do the trick just as well as what these other pills are doing today. With the 2 years of high school we had in the village, had a lot of young guys. They had a little time on their hands, and they'd always go into his place. He always had comic books along the wall, and they'd always read the comic books without buying any, and I know that got Charlie pretty upset.
There was a Ford dealership in this town, a Chrysler dealership in this town, a Chevrolet dealership in this town. Oh yeah, Hudson dealership also. Every little town around here had a dealership. Brownsville had Ford and Chevrolet. Mayville had Hudson, Nash, Ford, Chevrolet, Oldsmobile. They had a little of everything. the little town of Knowles. And we had a Chevrolet dealership and a Plymouth dealership.
In Theresa Station, there were 2 feed mills, Cull's feed mill and the co-op. Urban Schmidt was the well driller, and then it was Pat Wagner Lumber Company, and Bob Schultz took over the lumber company. Well, then we had the railroad down there. The canning company cans would come into Theresa Station, and they hauled them. Oh, then there was a beet dump. They raised sugar beets around here in World War II. Them trucks would be lined up sometimes a mile out of Theresa Station to get unloaded. And same on Saturday mornings with the 2 feed mills. They'd be lined up sometimes a mile out of Theresa Station, taking their turns to get the grains ground. And so it was a pretty busy town them days. And when I was, I can just remember this, George Wolfe, he had the gravel pit down there, and the pit is still there, but there's no more gravel, and he got all the gravel out of it.
I remember walking to school all the time, and then I would always have to stop at the IGA store where Rod just had the IGA store, and that IGA store had yard goods and clothing, groceries, just about everything you could think of. And I always had to bring stuff home for Ma from the grocery store. One time, Mrs. Olson had a hat store, and she had crocheted items in that, and my mother wanted me to take some doilies there to have them cleaned by Mrs. Olson. And somehow or another, I must have lost those, and I don't remember what happened, but it made me sick for a long time that I couldn't find those doilies that Ma sent me there with. Yeah, she had hats in the windows and all that, and then she had a daughter, Charlotte, that went to school with my sister, was confirmed with my sister. She's still living yet. It seemed my mother had company every Sunday, and my dad had a brother that lived in Milwaukee, and they brought friends along, and my mother would cook for all those people. And so Saturday mornings, first thing we did was had to clean up the whole stove, take it all apart, scrub the kitchen floor, scrub the steps, and then we would bake. And it would be angel foods and jello and torts, and I can't remember what. I suppose we mostly had mashed potatoes and something, I don't know, but that whole crew would always be there for supper.
Friday nights was the time to shop, and in summer there were band concerts. And they had a big wagon where the band would sit on. And every little town like here had a nice band, decent band, or 2, and they all had ball teams. And the kids went sleigh riding down the Brewery Hill over here, and on the river they'd make a spot for playing ice hockey. Even girls played. It was a nice town. Then we had firemen's picnics. One fireman picnic was up at Orange Dance Hall, and there were dances almost every week. My brother and I, and we had friends, and now we'd go to those dances. That was some of the entertainment. And of course we went in a bar too once in a while. Theresa Farmers Co-op. I did the trucking part of it, which was hauled cattle to Milwaukee once a week, and in between haul coal, all feed, seed, anything that farmers would use. But there was another mill at the station, actually it was a relative of ours, called Feed and Fuel. But for some reason during the war, it went to heck, and during the Depression. So the rest of the farmers got together and built a new mill. So this Call Feed and Fuel got less and less because the guy that was really running it was so against the Second World War because his son was in and got hurt pretty bad. They hated Germans or whatever. And he talked about that, and people got to know that. But then during the war, he got out of it, and his sister took over the mill. She was about 40 years old. She would handle bags of feed like a man. To run that mill, it was either a gas or a diesel, immense big engine. They sometimes had trouble starting that, but we had the man that lived only a couple blocks away from the mill, he would come and get started. But then when she took over, and Ralph, the one that got hurt in the army, came back home, he got married. He was in a wheelchair when he got married, but he got okay, that he could work. He took over the mill. And then they put in electric motors. Just think, electric motor. And then it was good. And when she got out of it, then her nephew and my brother left the farm out there where I was born, and they ran the mill.
I remember coming to Theresa because Dr. Langenfeld, the senior Dr. Langenfeld, was our doctor at Allenton. I guess the grocery stores at Colesville and at Allenton just weren't satisfactory, and the butcher shop for Mother and Dad, so they started coming to Theresa to shop.
When I went to school, Theresa was 418 population. Had 7 taverns and a brewery, a store, shoe shop, furniture store, and Hudson Garage. Yeah. Johnny Beck had a gas station on the north end of town. Wally Quant was south of town at a gas station. Louis Beck there were 7 gas stations in town. This was 41 then. And Friday nights, you were lucky if you could get across the traffic was so heavy that they passed a law that no trucks could go. I think it was 5 o'clock Friday night till midnight Sunday. Yeah, it was a busy town.
When I was a kid in Knowles, we had a creamery, we had a hardware store, 2 car dealerships, Knowles Producing Company, which was an implement dealership, and they had a mill. They had, like I said, we even had a stockyard. They bought the cattle from the farmers and they shipped them on the train. As kids, they'd let them out of the gate after they weighed them on a scale, and then they would tell us bin 5 or bin 6, and then we'd run down the aisle, and the gate would swing across, and you could hook it on the other side, and then the cattle would come down and go into that bin, see? The pigs and the cows and everything. And I think back, it was really kind of dangerous because a lot of these pigs and stuff would actually come after us. There'd be an old big pig and they'd chase us, and we'd run up the fence and sit on top while then they'd finally go in the bin, and we'd jump down and close the gate. And I'm thinking of how dangerous that was. Probably today they wouldn't even think of letting you do that. And most of the guys around were old farmers that worked there, weighing the cattle and whatever, you know.
I was born here in Theresa in 1926. As a youngster growing up, I was expected to help in the cheese factory. So every morning before going to school, I was assigned to sell milk. We had neighbors come in with pails, or we had a quart measure, and I'd ladle in whatever they wanted, 2 quarts and also pints. And the milk was 5 cents a quart.
1937 or 38, we went to a tractor instead of a horse. Well, all the neighbors said we'll never be able to farm without them horses, of course. But that particular first summer, I remember they had a lot of mosquitoes around. It was hot and we had an awful lot of mosquitoes. And the farmers were trying to cultivate their corn. They could not hold their horses down because the mosquitoes bothered them so much. Well, I just took the muffler off the tractor so the more of the smoke would blow on me, and I cultivated our corn at home. It worked pretty good. And then in a few years after that, I was probably 12 years old, something like that. We had that tractor, which I was probably the principal operator of. My father and mother and sister were all employed at the local cannery in Fall to process corn. It was something like 37 cents an hour. Oh, it was a going rate. Well, I'd left nobody there on the farm, and I was trying to do my share and do some of the farm work. That's why I think I inherited a bad back from about 15 years on up.
When I worked at Baker Canning, I worked the night shift because Grandma babysat my kids. We harvested only peas and corn. Those were the two crops that they did. And of course, at that time, we had not the modern equipment they have now to harvest the peas already off of the pod in the trucks, come and dump the peas and run them through. They had the viners out in the field, and they would bring the peas in on the vine and run them into the canning factory. And of course, one of your jobs as an inspector, which I was at that time, was to sort the peas, pick out any thistles, any weeds, anything else that might be in there. And then of course we had a large corn shed with all manual corn cutters. And I remember Bob Baker Jr. taught me how to run these cutters, and it was a timing. You had to, if you tried putting both cobs at once, it jammed the whole thing up. And then you had to either unjam it or call an attendant to come and unjam it for you. Once the canning factory closed here, I went to Mayville and worked at the cannery there. But like I said, we had a lot of Hispanic people here, wonderful people that came and worked the year. Baker had their own, they hired a cook. They did their own meals for, not for us, but for the workers that lived in the facilities we had on the Baker Canning grounds. They had 3 meals a day, breakfast, dinner, and supper. The kids were enrolled in the schools here up until the time that our corn pack was done and they went back to Texas or wherever they happened to come from.
My aunt and uncle came to visit in the evening, and I was still milking a cow named Hitler. And it was a nasty animal. It just didn't like people, and it wouldn't, obey when you wanted to chase it or things like that. And I happened to be milking Hitler, and Hitler didn't like when Aunt Florence started to talk to us, and he hauled off, or she hauled off with one foot and knocked me over into the gutter. The most cows I ever milked by hand was when my mother went to the hospital. That was in 1951. We had, I can't remember how many cows, but they were producing abundantly in June. And then we had like 600 pounds of milk a day, and my dad and I milked that, morning and night. Like it was 300 pounds in the morning and 300 pounds in the evening, and both of us got such sore hands and arms that's when my parents bought a milking machine.
Then I was a housekeeper for a school teacher that didn't live far from us. I got $18 a week. I had to give most of it home. And then later on I worked at West Bend Aluminum, and I stayed over at a Mr. and Mrs. Hahn over there who was friends with my parents. And I paid board there, and I come home on weekends, and first thing I had worked nights, had to get up Saturday mornings, clean the stove and all that, no matter what, and still paid rent at home. But that's how it was. We didn't know any different. Never regretted that we had to do that, When the boys would snap sweet corn, I was of a dating age. And my date would probably want to come around 6 o'clock or 6:30 or 7 or so. I could never go until the boys were fed and the dishes were done, then I could first go if it got to be 8:30. Because the boys those days, they didn't do dishes like they do nowadays. My son-in-laws, when I see all the work they do compared to what the guys did when I was that age, is really different.
When I was 14 years old, I went out working on farms. I worked for Hillary Strelo out of Mayville here. I got $50 a month. I stayed there, but 25 of it went home to help the family at home. Donnie, my older brother, he worked out and helped with farms and helped. The money went home, and Virginia and Janine, we all pitched in.
My father went to live with his Aunt Clementine and uncles John and Alvin at the old Wagner home on the death of his mother in 1927. And he talked a lot about how difficult it was to not be hungry during the Depression. He would hunt in the Rock River for turtles. He'd use a metal rod and he'd go wading in the river and he'd poke in the mud. And if he could find a turtle and catch it, he would sell it to a tavern for turtle soup.
The railroad would be replacing ties or replacing rail, and they would have what they call gandy gangs. They would sleep in old passenger cars, and them days there was steam engines, and they would bring a tender down, and that's where they got their fresh water out of a old steam engine tender. And they would have a cook car, and I remember there was some Reeds, husband and wife. They were the cooks, and the train would bring in meat in barrels. Sometimes they'd drop the barrels off the train, and the barrels would break open, and the meat would lay in the cinders, and the cook had to clean all that up. But anyway, the gandy gangs, they had what they called a motor car. They would had 2 trailers on it, and they had a Model A engine in the motor car. And my brother Jerry and I, we would run the motor car and go way out in the marsh and drop all the guys off, and then we'd have to take the motor car to a siding for the train to come through. And today they wouldn't even let you near the railroad. But the Gandys, after when they got paid, a lot of them would take off. A lot of them would just drink and drink and drink and plug the jukebox, and the jukebox would play all night. It had so much money in it. Really didn't have any troubles with them. I think there's only one time that I can remember we had to call the sheriff, but most of the Gandys spent time in prison. And I remember one guy, called him Trombone Miller. He used to stand next to the jukebox, and all night long he'd go burr, 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 burr. He'd go. My mother would even lend him money, maybe up to $20. And there was only one guy that I can remember. They called him the lawyer. They all had nicknames. And he had a big vocabulary, and he was the only guy that didn't pay him back. And I remember one time, it was spring of the year, I think it was, all of a sudden, here comes Trombone Miller. He jumped off the train and come in our tavern, and apparently the guys found out that the lawyer didn't pay my mother back, and when he got his rocking chair, which was unemployment money, all the guys up there in Minnesota, they grabbed a hold of him, took the $20 and sent it back to my mother. And Trombone Miller, he stopped in to find out if my mother got the money, and she did. So we never lost any money on that.
Well, years ago, we used to go to birthday parties, and then everybody would take a cake and all that, and you never get home till midnight. And that one night, I think we were by Uncle Hubert. And then when we got home, then the boys would always help get Dad out of the car, and I slept on the 3rd floor. And this particular night, I was going up to my bedroom, and we didn't have a whole lot of light. And when I got up there, all of a sudden, we had dark green shades. All of a sudden, somebody come out from behind the dark green shade. I was so scared, and here it was William. There was a railroad accident. A car was derailed or something, and you could see over the whole tracks from up in my bedroom. And here he didn't help get Pa out of the car. He was up in the bedroom before I got there and scared the dickens out of me.
My dad ran a garage in Knowles, Wisconsin. He built it back in the 20s, and he sold Page cars and Jewett cars. And at that time, they didn't bring them in with a semi or anything. They brought them in by railroad, and they brought them to Theresa Station. And he used to have somebody drive them over here, and then they would drive the cars back to Knowles. So they drove the cars there, and he sold them. Besides cars, he sold appliances, radios, whatever he could get his hands on, he sold, you know.
One Sunday, I remember my dad and Ralph and I came up from making cheese, and we heard on the radio about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So we only had radio in those days. Now you'd have it all over on television.
And my father, although he was taken out of school just before he graduated from the 10th grade, he became fascinated with radio gear when he served in World War II in North Africa and Italy. He was in the Signal Corps and had to repair radios and transmitters and so forth. And when he returned from the war, he went to night school for 2 years and subsequently became an electrician for the Milwaukee Road Railroad, and finished his career as assistant supervisor of the electrical department.
2 months after graduation, I was drafted into the Army, and I received training in Georgia and Arkansas. And at the finish of my training, we were on a list. Some were sent to Europe, and some were sent to the Pacific. And I always thought, gee, I hope I get sent to the Pacific. It was just winter time in the Battle of the Bulge. And I thought, you're fighting the enemy and the weather also. So I was sent to Hawaiian Islands, and from there to Saipan. That was a staging area, and we were all recruits that would replace servicemen that were lost. And I was sent to Okinawa. They had to capture Okinawa before they could invade Japan. I was sent to the 77th Infantry Division. Recently there was a movie, Hacksaw Ridge. It was a story about a conscientious objector who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he was a member of my division, the 77th. And in 1976, there was a reunion at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and I met this Desmond Doss. After Okinawa was taken June 21st, they told us we're going to be in the invasion of Japan. We're going to invade Kyushu. Then the atomic bomb was dropped, and that changed the course of the war. Millions of lives would have been lost if we had to go into Japan. Then I was in the occupation of Japan. We were sent to Hokkaido. It's the northernmost island of Japan Islands. Hokkaido had a climate just like Wisconsin. My first winter there, we had a lot of snow and cold. When we went to Japan, we were the first troops on Hokkaido. And when we came ashore, there was nobody in the streets. And people were looking out the windows. They were told that how cruel and how we would mistreat them. They needed somebody to work in a post exchange. I was sent to that post exchange. It was in Sapporo. There was Olympics in Sapporo. Eventually, I had enough points, and I was sent home.
Walter Gillick's father was a fuelman with the Baker Canning Company. And one Sunday morning, I don't know, it was about 10, 11 o'clock, he come in the tavern and he had a telegraph saying his son got killed over in Germany. And that was quite a shock to all of us. And then I forget it, a year or two after the war, his body come home. It came down to Theresa Station. We all got up and went over there, and Bex picked up the body and brought it to Theresa, and they had the funeral. It was a big funeral. And there's pictures of him at the Legion in Theresa, and pictures of them picking up the body down in Theresa Station. But that was a big deal that day when that funeral was.
So I went into the Army on September 24th of 1950. Came home on September 12th of 1952. Not quite 2 years. The other guys that went in with me, they were all gone home because I had hemorrhagic fever. I was in the hospital for 12 weeks in Seoul, Korea. So when they finally told me I was okay to go home, the guy came with a jeep and put me in a ship from Korea to Japan that same day, a different ship from Japan to Hawaiian Islands. The reason we went to Hawaiian Islands was we had, I think, 18 or 20 caskets of Hawaiian people that were killed. So we were there 3 days, but I didn't feel good. I don't know, not yet. So I just sat around shore in Pearl Harbor for 3 days. Then we got back on the ship and took off to Seattle, Washington. We got to Seattle, Washington on Labor Day. We were out about a mile on a ship. The portmaster would not come in and take that ship in. It was a holiday. We got called names. We were baby killers like Vietnam too. Nobody knew we were even there or cared less. So I was at Seattle a day, I think. Then we got on a train to Camp Carson, Colorado. I sat around there, I think, 10 days. One day the chaplain came around and was talking, and he said what I was doing there. I said, well, you tell me and we'll both know. I'm here 10 days, nothing is happening. So he went someplace, and about a half hour, my name was whole Camp Carson report. They thought I had spots on my lungs. Your film had the spots on. But then from there to Chicago, and I got on North Shore. I went to Milwaukee to the bus depot, and I called my brother-in-law to come and get me. And I got home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I went upstairs, put my overalls on, they were ready from the day I left. Went out in the barn and milked cows. Why? My brother had fallen down the silo and broke his leg.
Well, I actually was in the what they call the Cold War. That's where I spent my three years overseas. I spent it in Edinburgh, Scotland, and we were monitoring the Russians, but that was called the Cold War. See, there were troops, during the Korean War, there was a lot of troops in Europe. Just, they had to be there because of Russia. Russia was our enemy too yet, but we weren't at war with them.
I went in the Army in 1953. I took basic training in Camp Gordon, Georgia, as a lineman, And then I come home after basic training and school. I got a telegraph from the depot down there in Theresa Station that I was supposed to report to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And I was promoted from private to corporal. So I had to get corporal stripes, and my ma sold the corporal stripes on my uniforms. And then when I was walking around Theresa hearing all the guys that were in service or got out, how did you get corporal stripes? You're really trying to pull one. So I just got out the paperwork and showed them I was a corporal. Well, when I got to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, there was a kid, Donnie Meyer from Kikoski, me, and another guy named Kenny Panfield. He played football for the Chicago Cardinals. And I forget the other guy's name, but he was from Pittsburgh. Here it was an all-colored outfit that Eisenhower ordered the colored outfits to be broke up. I went to C Company, Donnie went to B Company, Panfield went to A Company, and the other guy went to Headquarters Company. There was 53 guys in the barracks, and I was the only white guy, and the same with, there was 270 people in the whole battalion, and we were the only 4 white guys.
After I got out of high school, I graduated. You had to get in the Army for 2 years, and I enlisted in the Air Force for 3 years, and then we got in the Korean War, and they drafted me for 3 more. So I ended up 6 years in the Air Force. And then I got married when I was in the Air Force, and ended up coming back to Wisconsin. When I was in the Air Force, I worked in Washington, D.C. for 4.5 years for the National Security Agency. And of course, it was all top secret, whatever. We had a brand new car, and I had a driver between the seats. We had a Thompson submachine gun, we had a Army rifle, we had weapons. We carried a .45, and they'd clamp a briefcase on my hand with a handcuff like, and then I would have to take it from, say, the FBI building to the Pentagon. I had one weekend that was really thrilling. I had to deliver one from the National Security Agency to the White House. We had a special badge to get in, and like our car too had a special license plate on it, and the police would never stop us because they knew we were carrying top secret material. I had to go to a certain person. They gave me the name, and he's the guy that had the key to get it off because it was clamped on and that was it. But amazing thing that happened, we drove into the White House and we were going to park the car, and all of a sudden here comes Harry Truman walking down right down the driveway.
I went to school here in Theresa, and I was the first one to go to high school. The older brothers and sisters all they were pretty much on their own after 8th grade. They all had to go to work. And right after I got out of 8th grade, I started in a butcher shop, Lang's Butcher Shop in Mayville. All through high school, I worked in a butcher shop. And my dad wanted me to quit high school, but they passed a law you had to go until you were 16 years old. And I was halfway through my junior year, and I thought I might as well finish, being that far. He would have made me quit if I wouldn't have had that job. My older brother, Donnie, he talked my dad into letting me finish high school. It wasn't that my dad didn't want me to go, he just didn't feel it was fair to the rest of them. Anyway, after high school, I was 17. I immediately joined the Navy, went to boot camp in Great Lakes, and they sent me out to San Diego to what they call the IC school. And it was an IC electrician we worked on telephones and gyro compasses and anything that communicated anything within the ship. Squawk boxes, wind anemometers, wind direction, gyro compass, worked on all that stuff. And my first ship was a USS Twining out of San Diego. It was a destroyer. And I signed up for officer school. And I was only on the destroyer for, I don't even remember, maybe 6 months. And we pulled into San Francisco, and I got noticed to go to Bainbridge, Maryland, to a preparatory school. And basically the school was assessed if you could pass certain requirements to become an officer. Well, there was about 350 of us. I don't know, a couple hundred washed out right away. Well, I ended up out of 199 guys, I probably ended up 197th in the class because they were all way, way above me. But I couldn't raise enough money to go to the university. I would have been transferred to the Naval Reserves, and we had to make about $200 a month on our own. So I went, then I went on an aircraft carrier. It was USS Tarawa. Put that out of commission in Philadelphia. And from there I went on the USS Intrepid and went to the Mediterranean. In fact, when we were in the Mediterranean, we were at Livorno, and it was in 1960, and I got to go to the Olympics. It was quite an experience.
And here's a guy who damn near got killed in a kamikaze attack in April 1945, right before the Okinawa invasion. He comes back, and he was one of the first guys on that minesweeper. So he was entitled to be one of the first guys off. And he just let it drop one day that he was the last guy off. And I asked him why. Why were you the last guy off? And he says, well, I didn't have a wife or a sweetheart, and all those other guys did. Ralph was just so outgoing. And of course, his house was kitty corner from the post office. That guarantees a lot of visits because, you went to pick up your mail. They did not have in-town delivery. So, all these people would hang out at the post office. They'd meet at the same time every day. And then there's Ralph's house right across the street. Well, why don't we go say hi to Ralph? That's just, he had constant people. And he loved it. And Ralph always wanted to know what we were doing. What had we been doing in the last month? He wanted to hear all the details because he couldn't get out. And he wanted to know what life was like out there. There was a big cheesemakers thing, and awards were given out for master cheesemaker, and Joe got the award. And somebody I knew told me that Joe Widmer, who got up to get the award, and all he could say was that everything he knew, everything that helped him become a master cheesemaker, he learned from his Uncle Ralph.
Well, I always knew there was something special about a small little town like this, and even going to the local school and going through the Solomon Juneau home and getting to experience that and knowing as my time went on where my family fit into this. Just being part of the local churches or knowing that going through historical documents and seeing your ancestors part of that history and part of that small town. And now myself, having a business in that town and being part of it and just being part of the historical society myself and knowing that preserving this history is so important for the next generation. The history is so important for me to know where I came from and to know where I am now is just, sometimes it's overwhelming, just amazing. But it makes you have a lot more respect and love for your community.